Here in the second standard of the reproductive system, we're going to talk about female anatomy in and out, as well as secondary sexual characteristics, hormones, and the process of ovulation. So the standard reads, I can describe the structure and function of each part of the female reproductive system. Last time we talked about the male reproductive system and its role in producing sperm cells, how to effectively transport them, but now we're going to do the same with females and add the layer of hosting fertilization. The 16th unit is all about the process of fetal development and pregnancy, so we're not going to get too in-depth, but just the beginning phases. So there are two primary sex organs for females, and like we mentioned with males, this is the organs that are responsible for creating those haploid sex cells. And so in females, this is going to be the two ovaries. The role of the ovaries is to produce oocytes, which are the same as eggs, via the process of oogenesis. That would be the process of creating those eggs, and also there's some side products. The other role of the ovaries is to produce female sex hormones. So we have estrogen, we have progesterone, there are some other ones including luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. There are a lot to mention, and so those are controlled via the ovaries as well. The female reproductive system has some additional specialized functions. So for instance, we have to transport the eggs to the site of fertilization. We have to provide a favorable environment for developing offspring. So we have to ensure that there's blood supply. We have to ensure that we can screen out toxins or any sort of waste products from affecting our developing fetus. And then lastly, when it's time to give birth, we have to have reproductive organs that are capable of stretching and pushing enough to transport that baby outside of the woman's body. So oogenesis is how we make human eggs. Again, there are two rounds of division. So we start with a stem cell in the ovaries, the primary oocyte. It divides once and cuts its chromosome number in half. So meiosis 1 is that reductive division. But you'll notice the division is uneven. One of the two daughter cells contains most of the cytoplasm, most of the organelles, and the other one just kind of has a nucleus and some scraps. That is called a polar body. We're going to go through a second division where we have another unequal divide here, and that polar body forms two more. Ultimately, what we ended up with in the male spermatogenesis was 4 viable sperm cells. That's not going to be the case in oogenesis. Here, because of these unequal divisions, we have attempted to stockpile all the resources from that primary oocyte into one egg. Reproductively and evolutionarily, this makes a lot of sense. Women are capable of hosting probably one pregnancy a year if they have a successful pregnancy, and if it's not an exception of twins, they're looking at one offspring. Whereas men, who are producing hundreds of millions of sperm, are capable of impregnating many different women in that same year. And so if a woman's trying to pass her genes on, she wants to make sure that her egg is as strong as possible. So she has one well-stocked egg. These 3 polar bodies are waste products and will eventually just be broken down by the woman's body, and this is the one that will mature. All right, so what happens to the egg? The process of ovulation is how we get those secondary oocytes, which is what we saw at the bottom row, and we release them from the ovaries into the uterine tubes where they can be fertilized. It's about a 28-day cycle in humans, but there's different things happening at different days. So for instance, the first few days are tagged as menstrual days. This is when she's shedding her uterus from the last pregnancy, from the last month rather, if there was no pregnancy that was successfully embedded. Her most fertile days fall around the middle of her cycle. So we're looking days 11 through 16, with 14 being peak fertility. Here's what we're seeing when we look at internal female anatomy. So we have these two ovaries, one on either side. We have those uterine tubes I mentioned. The uterus, which eventually will host the pregnancy if it is successfully fertilized. And then the cervix and vagina, responsible for sexual intercourse as well as delivering of the baby. So we're going to start and follow the path of the oocyte. So the ovaries are producing those oocytes and controlling the release of those hormones. From there, one ovary, pick one, right or left, per month is going to release an egg. That egg is going to get guided towards these odd fimbriae-like structures towards the fallopian tubes. Fallopian tubes, uterine tubes, they are the same thing. So these are the little fingers that'll reach out and guide the egg towards that tube, and the egg will then be ushered along it. If fertilization is to occur, that's where it's going to happen. It's going to happen in this fallopian tube. So there's little cilia here that are guiding that egg forward, and a sperm would have had to make it through the cervix, through the uterus, up into one of those tubes. And it had to pick the right one, because only one per month is going to host an egg. From there, let's say a sperm did reach the egg and it's headed next towards the uterus. The uterus is a muscular organ, but it's hollow, able to host a successful pregnancy, and it will receive the embryo and sustain its growth and development. So the placenta will form in here up against the uterine wall, and the uterus will thicken to welcome the embedding of an embryo. 9 months, we'll stay in here, stay in the uterus, and there's a whole standard on birth in the next unit. But let's say that there was no fertilization, that the egg floated all the way through here, there were no sperm cells, or at least no successful fertilization. Then we have to shed all the lining that we built up. So the cervix is a really narrow opening that sperm can go through, or that the uterus will be shed through before it then makes its way towards the vaginal canal. So this is where the penis can reach during intercourse, and it's also the channel for childbirth. Externally, when we're talking about female anatomy, collectively it's known as the vulva. So I think in American culture we tend to use the word vagina to mean any of those structures on the outside of female anatomy, when really we should be using the term vulva, because that includes the labia, it includes the urethra, it includes the clitoris. So all of those structures collectively are called the vulva. The vagina is just the reproductive canal. Okay, externally, we have two sets of protective skin and fat coverings, and those are called labia. So the labia majora enclose the entire vulva and keep all the internal structures protected. The labia minora are smaller, less fatty protective folds, and also contain a hood that covers the clitoris. There's really interesting comparative anatomy between male and female systems, where if you look at an embryo, which tissues will form which structures. For instance, the scrotum in men is the same tissue that forms labia in women. The clitoris is the only organ in humans known to be there strictly for pleasure. So this is the sexual pleasure organ. It has the highest density of nerve endings, even more than the head of the penis, out of any structure in the body, and is responsible for sexual pleasure during intercourse for a female. The vestibule is a small region that contains glands in between the urethra and the vagina, and that is to secrete mucus to aid in sexual intercourse when a female is sexually stimulated. Of course, the vaginal orifice, as we mentioned before, is either to deliver a child or the hole through which menses are shed at the end of a reproductive cycle. And then lastly, the urethra is part of the vulva. It is in here, protected by the labia, and it is strictly to eliminate urine. As far as sex hormones, we're going to talk about the childbirth ones more in the future, but for now, Estrogen is going to create an enlargement of these accessory organs. It's going to help regulate the thickening of the uterine wall, and it's going to encourage fat deposits in the breasts to create and develop a fuller breast shape. Progesterone is a secondary sort of female sex hormone that regulates a lot of the reproductive cycle as well as the production of milk within the mammary glands. When we're discussing primary sex characteristics of females, we're talking about how her ovaries and her internal structures are developed. Secondarily, we're not going to see body hair. We're not going to see a changing of the voice. We're going to see largely fat deposits shifting. So we'll see fat shifting to the hips. We'll see fat shifting to the breasts. And those are our biggest secondary sexual characteristics for females. To round it out, this is Carmen Carrera, and she is a trans woman and also a model. And this is what she looked like before transition, and this is what she looked like after transitioning. And we can see there's definitely a change in her shape, though I am sure she's had breast augmentation, or at least a lot of trans women do have breast augmentation. Upon taking hormones like estrogen, there will be an increase in fat deposits in the breast, though usually not to this degree.